Zilpha Lowery was a quiet, kind-hearted office worker. Quincy Young was a silent maintenance man with a disturbing secret. For 10 years, no one connected them until a hidden journal revealed the truth behind Zilpha's disappearance and exposed a decade-old obsession that turned into murder. Zilpha Lowery lived a quiet life in the small town of Marble Hill, North Carolina. At 44 years old, she wasn't the kind of person who stood out in a crowd. She kept to herself, worked as an office assistant at the local Department of Social Services, and was known to be gentle, polite, and always punctual. She lived alone. In a modest apartment just a short drive from her workplace, her life appeared predictable, even uneventful. That's why, when she suddenly vanished on March 23, 2006, the entire town was stunned. That Thursday morning began like any other. Zilpha arrived at work on time, completed some routine paperwork, and exchanged polite greetings with coworkers. At around 11 a.m., she signed out and told the front desk she wasn't feeling well. She walked out of the building and never returned. At first, no one thought much of it. People sometimes left work early. Maybe she went home to rest. Maybe she needed time to herself. But when she failed to show up the next day or answer, her phone concern quickly turned to alarm. Later that afternoon, police were contacted by one of Zilpha's close friends who had tried to reach her multiple times with no response. Officers visited her apartment and found her car parked out front. Nothing seemed out of place. The door was locked. Inside, her purse, wallet, phone, and car keys were sitting in plain view. It didn't look like a robbery. There were no signs. A forced entry, no sign of struggle, no blood, and no disturbance. Everything was as it should be except Zilpha was gone. The disappearance baffled police. A missing person case was opened, and over the next several days, officers canvassed the area. Flyers were posted across town. Friends, coworkers, and family were interviewed. Her phone records, financial accounts, and personal messages were all examined. There were no red flags, no enemies, no signs she planned to leave. She hadn't withdrawn any money. She hadn't bought a bus or plane ticket. Her life just stopped. Speculation quickly spread throughout Marble Hill. It was a small town where gossip traveled faster than news. Some believed Zilpha had run away to escape something or someone. Others whispered that maybe she was involved in something, secret or dangerous. But those who knew her best said there was nothing mysterious about Zilpha. She was quiet, dependable, and deeply rooted in her routine. She never dated much, didn't drink, and never got into trouble. As the weeks passed, leads dried up. Search parties were organized, dogs were brought in, and wooded areas were combed, but not a single clue was found. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Detectives worked the case hard in the first few months, but with no new information. The investigation slowly lost momentum. Eventually, the case file was closed and marked cold. Zilpha Lowery became a name on a flyer, a face in a faded photo, another unsolved mystery, and in the town of Marble Hill, a haunting question lingered. How does a person disappear without leaving a single trace? The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into years. With each passing month, the mystery of Zilpha Lowery's disappearance faded further from public attention. People moved on with their lives, and Marble Hill returned to its quiet routine. But one person couldn't forget Lieutenant Carol Meyer. She wasn't the lead investigator when the case first opened. But something about Zilpha's vanishing stuck with her. It wasn't just the lack of evidence, it was the silence. No activity, no sighting, no phone call. Most missing persons cases left behind some kind of trail. This one had nothing. That, to Meyer, meant someone had gone to great lengths to make Zilpha disappeared. Over the years, Meyer revisited the case repeatedly. Whenever there was a lull in active investigations, she'd open the dusty file and read through every page again. She kept a copy of Zilpha's photo pinned near her desk. She wasn't ready to let go. In her gut, she believed the answer was hiding in plain sight. There were too many odd details that hadn't added up. Why had Zilpha left work early without telling anyone why? Why did she leave everything behind in her apartment? If it was an abduction, how had it happened with no witnesses, no noise, no struggle. Meyer began retracing Zilpha's final days. She contacted her family, old co-workers, and friends again, even if they'd already been questioned this time. She asked different questions, ones that focused on behavior, routines, and feelings. What she discovered didn't lead to any immediate breakthroughs, but it painted a clearer picture. Zilpha had mentioned feeling uneasy during the last few weeks before her disappearance. Nothing specific, but she'd told a coworker she felt like someone had been following her. She started taking different routes home and occasionally stayed late at work for no clear reason. At the time, her comments were brushed off, but now they felt important. Though the original investigation had been thorough, Meyer believed it may have overlooked subtle patterns. She started to cross-reference other missing person cases in the area. None were similar. She also requested access to employee records at Zilpha's workplace, looking for anyone who had left the job or moved away shortly after Zilpha's disappearance. A few names came up, but nothing stood out. With no physical evidence, no body, and no suspect, Meyer's efforts were largely unofficial. The case was technically inactive, but she didn't care. To her, it was a matter of principle. Someone had taken Zilpha away, and they'd done it without leaving a trace. That kind of clean, precise disappearance wasn't random. It required planning and likely obsession. She was convinced that whoever was responsible hadn't done it for money or revenge. It had to be personal. Even as years passed and her colleagues moved on, Lieutenant Meyer quietly kept searching. She believed that one day, something would crack. Some small mistake the killer made would come to light. She didn't know when or how, but she held on to one belief. Cases don't stay cold forever. 7 years after Zilpha Lowery vanished, Marble Hill had nearly forgotten. Her name wasn't mentioned often anymore, and her case was spoken about only in hushed tones, like a painful memory the town didn't want to revisit. But fate has a way of resurrecting the past when no one expects it. In early spring of 2013, a land surveyor was walking through a wooded area about 12 miles outside of town. He had been hired to map a rural property line that bordered unused forest land. It was supposed to be a routine job, but in the dense underbrush just off an overgrown trail, he noticed something odd. A slight depression in the soil, unnatural and irregular. Out of curiosity, he marked the location and returned the next day with a small shovel. A few minutes of digging uncovered something chilling: a piece of fabric, decayed and barely holding together. Beneath it was bone. Authorities were called immediately. The site was cordoned off, and a forensics team was brought in to carefully exhume what was quickly confirmed to be human remains. The grave was shallow, unmarked, and had been there for years. It had been partially disturbed by weather and wildlife. But despite the damage, enough remained intact for investigators to run identification tests. Dental records confirmed what some feared and others had stopped believing possible. The remains belonged to Zilpha Lowery. News of the discovery spread quickly for many. It was a shock. For Lieutenant Carol Meyer, it was the moment she had been waiting for. The case was no longer just a disappearance, it was officially a murder. The forensic examination revealed critical details. Zilpha had suffered blunt force trauma to the skull. Her body had been wrapped loosely in a decaying tarp and buried, with no effort to disguise the grave beyond a thin layer of soil and leaves. No clothing or items were found that could identify a suspect. The area was remote, surrounded by woods, and used mostly by hunters and hikers. Whoever buried her there had chosen the spot well. Unfortunately, the condition of the body presented challenges. Years of exposure to the elements had stripped away most forensic evidence. No fingerprints. No usable DNA. No murder weapon. The scene was practically sterile. It was frustrating, but not surprising. The killer had taken their time and planned carefully. It was a professional-level cleanup, yet no one ever suspected Zilpha had any enemies capable of such precision. Still, the discovery reignited the investigation. Meyer returned to her files with a new sense of urgency. She knew that even after all this time, people talk. Memories shift. Details resurface. And now that they had a body and a confirmed timeline, And a crime scene? The forest had hidden the truth for 7 long years. But now, with Zilpha finally found, the pieces could begin falling into place. The silence that had surrounded the case was starting to crack. In that silence, Meyer was convinced the killer had begun to make mistakes. The discovery of Zilpha Lowery's body brought renewed focus to the case. But even with this major breakthrough, the investigation remained frustratingly difficult. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon, and no witness. The location where her body was found had been open to the public for years, which meant any trace evidence was likely long gone. Still, Lieutenant Carol Meyer pressed on. With Zilpha now confirmed as a murder victim, she shifted her attention from theories to patterns. Someone had wanted Zilpha gone, and whoever it was had carefully erased almost every sign of their involvement. But not completely. It was during a routine re-interview in late 2015 that a single, nearly forgotten comment opened a new path. One of Zilpha's former co-workers casually mentioned how in the weeks before she vanished, Zilpha had grown increasingly uneasy. She didn't like leaving the building late. She'd once asked to switch parking spots to be closer to the door. Most people thought she was just being overly cautious, but now it felt like something more, digging deeper into workplace connections. Meyer examined employee and contractor lists tied to the Department of Social Services during the time Zilpha worked there. One name raised a red flag: Quincy Young, a part-time maintenance worker who had been contracted through a private company. He was quiet, stayed mostly to himself, and had worked there for about 6 months before suddenly leaving just a few weeks after Zilpha disappeared. The timing was suspicious. Meyer tracked Quincy to Kentucky, where he had been living under the radar. She requested his employment records and background check. Quincy had no major criminal record. But there were red flags. A dismissed restraining order filed by a woman in another state, pattern of unstable jobs, and a reputation for being socially withdrawn and volatile. While there was no direct evidence connecting Quincy to Zilpha's murder, Meyer couldn't ignore the timing of his departure. She obtained a search warrant for a storage unit he had been renting since shortly after Zilpha disappeared. What she found inside changed everything. Inside the unit were boxes of old clothes, tools, and what seemed to be trash at first glance. But at the bottom of one box was a stack of notebooks, tightly packed and dated. Page after page was filled with erratic handwriting, thoughts, confessions, and disturbing fantasies. Many of the entries were focused on a woman. She was never named directly, but descriptions matched Zilpha's appearance and routine. One entry read, "She looks at me like I'm nothing, but I see everything. I know where she goes. I know how she moves." The most damning entry was dated March 23rd, 2006, the day Zilpha disappeared. It read, "She finally saw me. She knew. I couldn't let her tell anyone." To Meyer. That was the break they had waited nearly a decade for. There were still hurdles ahead, and the writings alone might not be enough for a conviction, but they provided something no other piece of evidence had: a connection, a voice, a mind unraveling under obsession, possibly a confession hidden in madness, with the journals discovered in Quincy Young's storage unit. The investigation took a decisive turn. For nearly 10 years, the case had been defined by what it lacked: no witnesses, no physical evidence, no clear suspect. But now, authorities had something more intimate than DNA or surveillance footage. They had words, pages and pages of obsessive, disturbing thoughts that painted a chilling picture of a man fixated on a woman who matched Zilpha Lowery in both routine and appearance. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a trail of thoughts that led uncomfortably close to the truth. Prosecutors began building their case carefully. They couldn't rely on the writings alone, so they traced Quincy's whereabouts at the time of the murder. Phone records confirmed he had no solid alibi for. March 23, 2006, witnesses from his past jobs described him as erratic and prone to angry outbursts, particularly around women who ignored him or rejected his attention. One former coworker recalled him being overly familiar with female employees, following them around silently and watching them during breaks. Another noted, he disappeared from work the day after Zilpha went missing and never returned. The entries and the journals grew darker as investigators analyzed them further. They revealed a man becoming increasingly paranoid, writing about people watching him and how she knew what I was. Many entries referenced hiding in plain sight, and several discussed burial and decay in unsettling detail. One even described a location that, when compared to maps, closely resembled the remote area where Zilpha's body was found. With this evidence in hand, Quincy Young was arrested in 2016 and charged with the murder of Zilpha Lowery. The trial began later that year and immediately captured public attention. For a case that had gone cold for a decade, the courtroom now overflowed with reporters, former co-workers, and members of Zilpha's family, all waiting for justice that had long seemed unreachable. The prosecution leaned heavily on the journals. While not a traditional confession, they were argued to be a psychological window into Quincy's obsession with Zilpha. The entry from March 23rd was especially crucial. The defense, however, pushed back hard. They claimed the writings were fictional, the fantasies of a mentally unwell man, and pointed out the lack of physical evidence tying Quincy directly to the crime scene. Without DNA, fingerprints, or witnesses, they argued, the case was built on assumptions and interpretations. Still, the jury was deeply disturbed by what they read: the detail, the timing, the consistency with known facts. After 3 days of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Quincy Young was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the town of Marble Hill, it was the end of a chapter that had haunted them for 10 years. For Lieutenant Carol Meyer, it was the resolution to a case she refused to abandon. And for Zilpha Lowery, it was justice delayed, but not denied. Her story was finally complete, not forgotten, but remembered and honored with the truth.